Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class. We have been following the life of Abram, and we're going to continue to do that. And one of the reasons we're doing it is not just to, learn Bible history and learn about Bible stories, but to look at the example that he sets for us as a person who listens to God, who obeys God, and lives his life with God as his director, I guess you could say. And so it's been interesting so far. We started out with Abram and his father, and they were commissioned. I guess it was Abram's father that was led to go up to the land of Canaan. And actually he didn't make it, but Abram eventually does. And they lived there in the land of Haran for a while. As you'll recall, they were both very wealthy, Abram's father and he himself. And as they stopped there in Haran, they got even more wealthy. They stayed there for a few years until Abram's father died. And then God sort of taps him on the shoulder and says, okay, now it's time for you to go the rest of the way to Canaan. So that's exactly what he does. He sets up camp there and runs into a bit of a problem, namely that there's famine. And, in those days, you couldn't survive in a famine because there were, you couldn't just go to Costco and stock up on stuff. You were totally responsible for making your own food and, providing everything. And, of course, Abram at this time is responsible not just for himself and his immediate family, but for everybody else who's working for him. So he was forced to go down to Egypt, if you'll recall. And some kind of crazy things happened while he was in Egypt. But the whole interesting thing about that was, we had mentioned that some of the things that happened while he was in Egypt get repeated again, like about 400 years later, when Israel finds themselves once again in Egypt and trying to get out. And we're going to see a couple of more things like that, parallels that we see in today's part of the story. So he goes back to Canaan, where they had lived before the famine and before they went to Egypt. We're not sure exactly how long. And this is the part of the story that we're going to pick up on right now. So Genesis 13, the first couple of verses kind of get us started. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. So now this is a return trip. Now what is the Negev? Actually, we still refer to that area today. It's the southern part of Israel. And for some reason, we're not really clear why, their first stop, Abram's first stop, is here in this land of the Negev. And one of the things that that part of Israel is noted for, or maybe I should say is not noted for, is like really fertile ground. Now, I think we have to accept the fact that probably things during the time of Abram were different than they are now, but I did have the opportunity to go to Israel, and I know that everything south of the Dead Sea is pretty much just rocks and sand, desert. I mean, it's not the kind of place you would want to set up housekeeping, especially if you had a lot of animals to take care of. Well, I'm going to assume that the climate might have been a little bit different then, because for whatever reason, Abram stops here. And of course, he's got all of this wealth that he has accumulated in both in Haran and in Egypt, and he's ready to, set up housekeeping in a more permanent setting. So let's read the next couple of verses. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So a few things going on here. That first sentence in those verses we just read tells us that after he left the Negev, he sort of wandered around from place to place. And this is where it gets interesting, because in the same way, you see, or we will see in about 400 years, Israel doing the same thing. They're in the wilderness, very much like the Negev for Abram, and they wander from place to place as they follow Moses through the wilderness. And, I think there's some good things that come from these times of testing, like we were talking about last time. Abram learned that God could take a bad situation and turn it into something good. He kind of experienced that, receiving God's blessing. If you have to pack up your whole family and go into a land where you're going to be a refugee, I don't think he was expecting to come away richer than he went down there with. In fact, he probably was just hoping he could keep most of what he had. But he ends up walking away richer, and that's exactly what happens 400 years later with Israel as they leave Egypt the second time. So these are, to me, that's just kind of interesting. It's almost like a preview of what's going to happen later in amongst his ancestors. So wandering from place to place, but he finally gets back home, and that must have been nice, because I know every time I go away on a trip, if I'm away for a week or so, usually I'm always excited about getting home. There's something about just having a regular schedule and not have to worry about living out of a suitcase. Of course, for Abram, who was a nomad, I guess that was maybe something that he was a little more used to. But it just must have been nice to go back to Bethel. Bethel, by the way, means house of God. So, that's kind of cool. And also, it mentions here that he set up an altar and he called on the name of the Lord. And I think we can learn something from that. I mean, we don't do things today exactly like Abram did back then. I mean, we're not building altars and killing animals and sacrificing them to God. But we understand that that was Abram's way of acknowledging God and giving thanks to God. And that whole sacrifice system goes all the way back to Cain and Abel. So this was something that was, part of life back then. But it also says that he called on the name of the Lord. And to me, that says that he established and worked on this relationship that he had with God, that he expressed his dependence on God by calling upon him. And I don't know exactly, what he was calling God for. Maybe just to continue to protect his people and, all his livestock, and just to, deal with the day-by-day issues that come along. But I think that's one good thing about having your feet planted in the same place. And it was like he established, it became part of his life again to have these normal times of worship. And of course, we do that now. Every Sunday, at least once a week, we try to get ourselves into a place of corporate worship. And I really think that setting up the altar marked a specific place where people could go, not just Abram himself, but other people. And actually Bethel in the history of Israel becomes kind of a holy place that they go for worship. So he establishes this place, and more important than the place, he establishes this habit of regularly coming to God, bringing him sacrifices, and just acknowledging his need for God. So there's a good lesson for us. I know that sometimes when I go away, I get a lot more lackadaisical about my devotional times and reading the Bible and prayer and stuff like that. But when I'm home, like I am now in my comfortable little living room, it's a lot easier to stay on schedule with things like that and to enjoy times of fellowship with God. So what happens next? Something comes up. Another problem comes up. And we'll read verses 5 to 7. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. and quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. And the Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. I guess you get the sense that things were getting a little crowded here. I mean, in a way, this was a good problem, because that means their wealth and, their livestock was increasing to the point where they needed to spread out. And that's good in the sense that remember, that's what God wanted people to do anyway. He didn't want them to kind of huddle together in cities. He wanted them to go out and populate the earth and, multiply and fill the earth with people. And so I guess that's part of this process now, is these two family groups separate and cover even more ground. So this is, I guess, different than the problem he had with the famine. Almost the opposite problem. Now he is so prosperous that they're bumping into each other and rubbing elbows, and they've got to do something about it. So Abram comes up with a plan. Let's read about this plan that he comes up with in verses 8 and 9. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." This was Abram's solution to the problem. And it's interesting. One thing we learn is the importance of family. And Abram, doesn't want to cause any rifts in the family, because those relationships, family relationships, are really some of the best and most precious things any of us can have. A loving family. What if you were a billionaire and everybody hated you? You didn't have anyone to be intimate with or to share your wealth with. I mean, that'd be kind of a bummer. But Abram, I think, is appreciating the fact that the value that he has on family, and the way that he sort of took Lot under his wings, even before all this, when they started out from the land of Ur, almost like a second son. And so this is the solution he comes up with, and it's kind of interesting, because we learn something else here, I think, in the way Abram handled this situation. And you'll notice he said, "You decide which way you want to go." Now, remember, this was a patriarchal society. And Abram, as the senior in charge, really could have just said, "Lot, you go here and I'm going here." But he doesn't do that. He tells Lot that you can have the choice. And I think there's a great deal of wisdom in that, because Lot would never be able to come back to Abram, maybe things didn't work out wherever he ended up. He couldn't come back to Abram and start complaining, "This land that you gave to me isn't as good as the land that you kept for yourself." And I think maybe Abram kind of foresaw that as a possibility. So he gives Lot the choice. In this way, Lot can never blame anything on Abram, and Abram gets to live in peace. And I think really it was living in peace that Abram put a higher premium on than just having maybe land that was a little better for, raising sheep. And this is a biblical principle. We see this in the New Testament in Romans 4:19. "Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification." And again in Romans 12:18, "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." Peace is valuable. What if Abram had taken the better land, maybe, and maybe ended up with more sheep and camels and goats and all this wealth, but then Lot would get jealous and maybe think about fighting against Abram, and now Abram's got to raise an army to protect himself. The whole thing kind of snowballs out of proportion. So what Abram really put a premium on was living a life in peace. And, people will do all kinds of things to get wealth and to get money. And sometimes it costs them dearly when it comes to their relationship with other people. So I think there was a great deal of wisdom we see. Now, I'm going to kind of summarize what happens next. So Lot looks around, and they're kind of, I'm not sure exactly where they are at this point when they're having this conversation, but I know that in that area you've got the hill country, and you can look down into the valley, the Jordan Valley. And as I said, I've had the chance to be there, and looking down from a higher elevation into the Jordan Valley is something that probably would have been easy from many different vantage points for them to do. And at that time, as Lot looked down, I think he probably could see this lush green valley. Now, I can tell you that today, anything around the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley is not exactly lush and green. But again, I think it's probably back in that day, there's evidence that like all around the Dead Sea, there was all kinds of people living, and they were being very prosperous. Right now, the only thing that's good for is harvesting salt and minerals. I mean, it's really kind of desert. And it doesn't get green until you start going farther north in Israel. And, well, even in the Jordan Valley extends, pretty far north. Anyway, the bottom line is, Lot looks at this land, and he's probably right in saying that this is going to make him more prosperous. But Abram is willing to concede. And I think one of the foundational things about Abram is that he has learned that it's not he who blesses himself, but it's God who blesses him. And I think the reason Abram wasn't worried so much about what land he was going to end up with was because he's already learned at this point in his life that God is going to provide for him. And it's not just his effort or having the best land that's going to make him successful, but it's having the blessing of God. And we come to see as the story unfolds that Lot's choice to go down into the valley ends up causing a great deal of trouble for him. One of the things that's mentioned here in regards to this land that Lot chooses to dwell in is the fact that it's where Sodom and Gomorrah is. And if that doesn't ring a bell to you, the people of Sodom, it says specifically here, now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. This unfolds in another story that we'll get to eventually. But, it's having this good land, this very fertile land, but then ending up having to rub shoulders with these people that are really not morally on the same par with Lot. But he was willing to concede, he was willing to put up with the fact that there were these wicked, evil people in his neighborhood now, just so that he could enjoy the benefits of the land. And this really kind of comes back to bite him in the future. But then let's continue on. So this is where we kind of leave Abram. He's up in the hills. Lot is down in the valley. And we continue on and read from verse 14. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are, to the north, the south, the east, and the west. All the land that you see I will give you and your offspring. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring would be counted. I think God maybe wanted Abram to just settle down, breathe, take a deep breath, and remember his overall destination, this promise that God had made, that he was going to make a great nation out of Abram. And that's good to stop and think about, the big picture every once in a while, because it helps us through each day, the day-by-day things that you can kind of get focused in and to kind of absorb your attention and your energy. It's good to every once in a while just stop and remember this promise that God makes to all of us. And then finally, this chapter ends by explaining what happens next. And so we come to Genesis 13, verses 17 and 18. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents, and there he built an altar to the Lord. As we come to, how do we conclude all this, and what is the real lesson here? Well, we learn lessons about living a life of faith, being blessed by living a life of obedience to God, the value of living in peace with those people around you. So those are some important lessons we've already talked about. But here's one very curious thing that we have to acknowledge, and as we wind up. Abram never saw that. You realize that Abram never really saw these promises come true. I mean, how could he? Because when he dies, he's still, part of this smaller family group. Certainly wouldn't be defined as a great nation. So this was something that Abram actually never saw with his own eyes. And I think this is another principle. It's a very important principle when we think about the Christian worldview. I mean, let's talk about stopping and remembering what we're trying to do here in an overall sense. We're learning, first of all, what it means to be a Christian and what it means to have this Christian worldview. And this is a very important part of it, what we're going to look at now. That Abram, these promises were really something that was going to happen in the future that Abram never witnessed. And in the same way, we're going to see guys like Moses. He leads the people of Israel all the way up to the promised land, but he never enters in. And those promises that God made to Moses as well, they were always something that were in the future that he never saw. Now there's a really interesting verse that kind of puts this in perspective as we try to work on how do we turn this into a principle for Christian living. And it's found in the book of Hebrews. It's interesting that in the New Testament there are a number of places where people in the New Testament think about people in the Old Testament and make reference to them as examples, just like we're doing now. And in Hebrews 11, it's actually called, this whole chapter is called, well, what is it called? Something like the Hall of Fame of people of faith. And it lists all these people in the Old Testament that live lives of faith. And of course, Abram gets a lot of attention because he definitely lived a life of faith. And it kind of sums up the attitude that we have as people of faith. And now this is from Hebrews 11, verses 11 to 16. These people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. They were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. And I think this kind of sums up the way we should think about our expectations for living this Christian life. Now, it wasn't that all of those people in the Old Testament, and we're thinking specifically of Abram, didn't receive God's blessing while they were still alive. And the same thing is true with us. If we walk a life of faith, God will reward us, just as he rewarded Abram. But the real promise, the big promise, and the big expectation that Abram had was something that, as we said, he never really saw. He never witnessed this. I mean, Israel doesn't really become a nation for, 400 plus years later, after they wander around in the wilderness for 40 years and finally they step into the promised land. And even then it wasn't like smooth sailing. And I guess you could probably argue that, the land that God was showing Abram as far as he could see, north, south, east, west, that throughout history, Israel never fully occupied the land that was described. So we're talking about the complete fulfillment of this promise, something that's going to happen in the future. And the same thing is true with us. The really big promises, the really great things that we have to look forward to, an eternal life with God in heaven. He said, I go to prepare a place for you, mansions in heaven. We have so much to look forward to, but we won't see that until after we die or until the Lord comes. And you can put that in contrast with somebody in the world who really, whatever they get, they have to get now. It's like you go for the gusto because you only have one life to live and there's nothing beyond that, so you try to grab everything that you can. This is the way the world thinks. But for those of us who are Christians, we can relax because you don't have to worry about accumulating, mountains of wealth, because you're going to be walking on streets of heaven. There's this story about a guy that he's allowed to bring one thing into heaven, and he just happened to have, a few gold coins that he highly valued. And when he gets to the gates of heaven, St. Peter looks at him and said, "What, you brought pavement? Because the streets are made of gold." The things that we value and fight over and work so hard for here are going to be nothing compared to what we look forward to and what we will receive with our eternity with God. So I hope that's an encouragement to you. We learn so many lessons from, anybody that lives the life of faith. I know people today that have walked that walk of faith, and I've seen God do tremendous things through them. So I hope this is an encouragement for you to think about what it is how God wants to bless you and what it is He wants to accomplish in your life so that you can be right now storing up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Well, anyway, this is it's kind of fun going through the life of Abram, and there's more to come. There's a lot more that we're going to be looking at. So I hope you'll be able to join us again next time as we continue to look at the life of Abram in Gen Z Bible class.